Hey guys, coming back for American Crime Story, The People vs. O.J. Simpson, Episode 5, The Race Card, and holy shit, this episode. I mean, last week's episode was really intense, definitely. Things were really intense, things were really heating up in the trial, and you can tell that, we really did see the sides against each other. But that is nothing compared to this episode. This episode was a masterpiece. I mean, this episode was just incredible. There was so much. I mean, not only was there so many great emotional scenes this episode, but there was such a deep subtext in this episode as well. I really love the meaning of the overall episode. The episode really is talking about, should a black man, like Darden or like Cochran, really, focus on who they actually are and what people like them have been through and things like that, and all the backlash they got into. And I'll say this, I'm pretty sure not a lot of what happened in this episode actually happened in the case, but I don't give a shit because this episode was still incredible. There were so many amazing things about it, and let's just get into it because I have a lot to say about this episode. And whew, it really is getting crazy, I gotta say. As much as I love this show and as much as it's one of my favorite shows to watch every week, it is a very hard show to watch at times. This episode definitely showed that. Starting with the first scene, which was as as amazing as it was tragic, and really was just a perfect way I think to start the episode. So we start with Cochran, who I gotta say, I mean, I've said it before, Courtney B. Vance is incredible in this show, but this episode, literally, I think every scene of his was an Emmy scene. I mean, literally, you could take any of his scenes in this episode and just submit that to the Emmys, because he's just an incredible force in nature. This guy is amazing, and he better win an Emmy, come Emmy season. Definitely, he definitely deserves it. But we see in 1982, Cochran is taking his children to dinner, and a police car comes after his vehicle, and he tells his girls to say nothing and have their lawyer talk to the police. And this very much reminded me of Straight Outta Compton. If you guys remember in Straight Outta Compton, there were teenagers that were regularly searched because, the cops thought that they all were drug dealers, things like that. Well, that's kind of what's going on with Cochran here. He hands the officer his license, tells him he's just gonna get his registration, and the officer tells him to keep his hands on the wheel, and he asks him where he's heading, and he says he's taking his daughters to dinner, and asks the officer why he pulled him over. He says he seemed to change lanes without signaling 2 blocks back, and Cochran says he always signals, especially with his girls in the car, and says this is the third time someone's pulled him over this week for no reason. Now, we gotta remember, Cochran's not just some random guy. This is a district attorney, and he's being pulled over. I mean, this is some serious shit, definitely. I mean, especially someone like Cochran can be pulled over. Literally anyone can be pulled over. There really was no such thing as safe for a black man in the 1980s, and I think they really showed that here. The officer asks if this is his vehicle. He says if he lets him go into the glove box, he'll show him his registration. He asks his daughters if this is their father's car, and he literally asks his daughters, which that was a dick move. I understand the officer's doing his job, but come on, man, seriously. Cochran says not to talk to his children. He knows the drill. He's black, driving in a fancy white neighborhood in a nice car. He pulls him over so he could leave his children out of it. The officer then tells him to get out of the car and tells him he needs to cuff him because of his hostile attitude, which Cochran was just pissed, which was understandable, and I can understand why he got upset when he did. The officer really had no right to do this. Cochran tells him to let him get his registration, find out who he is, and if he doesn't let him take his opportunity, he will regret it. The officer tells him to stay there, walks away. Cochran promises his daughters they will be at the restaurant in 5 minutes, and all the white people you see are staring at the car, and you can tell this makes Cochran uncomfortable, but he's clearly used to it. I mean, like he said, this has happened to him 3 times, so, and especially the world that Cochran has lived in, he's not, he's definitely used to this, so this isn't too strange for him. The officer uncuffs him, tells him to turn around, and then realizes that he's a DA, and tells him to have a nice night, and the way that the officer was kind of threatened by him, I thought that was really well done, the way he's just like, have a nice day, district attorney, because he realizes that he really has no power over him, and he gets back in the car, and his daughters ask what the officer said to him, and if he called him the N-word, and he says he didn't have to, and tells his girls to never use that word ever. It's a terrible word, and that is a very important part of this episode, and we'll get into why. We see back in 1995 though, Cochran and Dale are in church, and Cochran's told to come forward, and the preacher says a prayer for Cochran and the trial, and Marcia, Darden, and Hogman watch the prayer in the news, and Cochran talks about how Darden's only being used as an attorney because he's black. By the way, I love Marcia's line of her being like, now they have Jesus on their side. That was really funny. Basically Cochran talks about Darden's only being used as an attorney because he's black, which is kind of true, and I think that's the reason Marsh turns off the TV, because she doesn't want to admit that that's really the only reason they're using him. She's using him because she knows they have a black jury, and they, in a court, her section is full of whites, and Darden really is the only black one there, and obviously she needs him because of that. He's also very good at what he does, but that was basically the main reason, because when you have your opposing side, which is pretty much dominated by black people, and they're defending someone that is black, and you're trying to oppose someone that is black, you need someone that is black to be able to do that. And Shapiro then tells Carl that he appreciates his concern, but he refused to be in the room with a certain individual, and he thinks he knows why. And Carl says he doesn't even know who he's talking about, and he asks if it's Cochran, and Shapiro says it's actually Lee. And Carl asks why he drove all the way over there if he wasn't going to go in, and Shapiro says he doesn't understand. He's a great godfather of one of his children, and Carl asks what he tells the team. He says to tell them that he knows that he's the source that leaked it to the New York Daily News, that he was in over his head, that he was steamrolled, it's inflammatory, and it's a lie. And just Shapiro really comes across as childish here. I mean, I've said it before that Shapiro's kind of just immature and power hungry, but that is really shown here. I mean, just the fact that he's saying all these things, and Carl goes to sit down. Cochran at first asks where Shapiro is, but says not to tell him, just to sit down and not worry about it. And you can tell that Cochran definitely has the upper hand here. I mean, as much as Shapiro wants to be in control, he knows he's dominated by Cochran. He really can't do anything at this point. And we see Shapiro does eventually arrive. He decides, whatever, I'll just go. So Shapiro calls Lee Judas, and Lee says that he's not Jesus, which, yeah, Shapiro's acting like he's Jesus, and he's not. And he tells Shapiro to blow it out his ass, and Cochran tells everyone to take a folder. Marcia then goes over the evidence that Simpson did it with her team, and while the Dream Team tries to find counter-responses to Marcia's accusations, I really love the way this scene was done. We see basically all the claims that Marcia's making, and then how the Dream Team is kind of going against it. Like, they're kind of saying the opposite. I thought that was really well done. We really got to see both sides play out really well. Not that we haven't, but just the way that that was done was really cool. Cochran assures him that evidence doesn't win the day. Jurors go with what makes the most sense, and they're here to tell a story. Their job is to tell that story better than the other side tells theirs. And I really do agree with Cochran with that. I mean, really, when you think about it, it's not based on who's wrong and who's right. It's based on who told the more convincing story, whose story just makes more sense, and what sounds most plausible. That's really what it has to do with. So Marcia gives everyone a list of who they'll be putting on the stand, and this is one of the biggest parts of the episode. When she gets to Darden, she gives him Van Adder and Fuhrman, and obviously he's less than pleased about this because of all the accusations and rumors surrounding Fuhrman. She tells him they all know what to do and dismisses them. Darden stays and at first tries to ask her a question, but then says, let's go to work. And he goes to meet with Fuhrman and asks him the designated questions that Marcia gave them to ask. He tells Fuhrman the defense plans to raise some instance from his past allegations of things. He said that they will come back to him. He asks what kind of allegations. Darden says they're going to claim he's racist. Fuhrman says that that's not going to be an issue with him. He works with black cops every day. He even thinks his SID investigated one of his black buddies, and Darden tells Marcia he met with Fuhrman and he said all the appropriate things, but he's just not right, and he gets very bad vibes about him. Like, just something that Fuhrman is saying, Darden doesn't buy, and he really doesn't buy the fact, I like what Darden says here, that basically, he's one of those people who doesn't think anyone can see how he really feels because he acts polite, and Marcia says that doesn't make any sense because when someone acts polite, then they are polite, and that's not really true. They really portrayed Marcia as looking at things in a very black or white way. Like, it's kind of like right or it's wrong. There's really no middle and other ways to look at it, which I think is really interesting, definitely. And I also think this was the first episode that really didn't portray Marcia as a great person. I mean, they really showed that Marcia was not perfect, and she did make some mistakes, and she wasn't the nicest person. I think they did a good job with showing that here. And basically she asks if she's out lying, saying he's bringing preconception to this because he's black, and he says he doesn't expect her to understand, but there's a way that certain white people talk to black people. It's disingenuous, and he says that Fuhrman didn't have to be a witness. He's not even the cop who entered the gloves into evidence. He doesn't have to take the stand, and she says that he does, and I like seeing things get complicated here. Up until now, we've really seen Darden and Marcia be very cordial to each other. Not really cordial, but they've acted really very close friends, and we really haven't seen any drama between them, especially last week, and there was all this drama. Darden and Marcia really seem like the breathing point where we could breathe and be like, okay, these two are fine at least. And here, now, no, they're even at each other's throats in this episode, which it's crazy. It really is. And basically, he says that he needs to get him he needs to get him ready, so massage and do whatever is necessary to make him come across as credible. And then we see a very effective scene. Ido talks to a man, Dominic Dunn, who lost his daughter in a murder, not unlike Goldman's or Nicole's, and he says he's offering him a seat in the front of the trial next to the Goldmans, and he feels that he'll be able to sympathize with them in a way the rest of them cannot, that he'll know to deal with them, not intrude or ask inappropriate questions. And Dunn hopes that Simpson doesn't just end up with a slap in the wrist like his daughter Dominique's murder. And Ido then shows him a fan letter he got from Arsenio Hall, and it's a very interesting scene. Just the way that he didn't seem to care as much about this man's emotion and more just about publicity and things like that. It's very interesting the way they're portraying Ido here. So we see protests about Simpson saying, let the juice loose, and Darden goes to talk to Cochran, tells him the press conference he gave about him was cheap shot, it was unfair and beneath the both of them as professionals. He says, in this trial, they're equals, everything from their past is out the window, so it's his sincere hope that they can move from this point forward, treat each other with respect, and basically, he just wants them to be cordial, even though that they, are against each other. That doesn't mean they have to be enemies. But Cochran says that he's not trying to be respectful, he's trying to win, and that is no more evidence in this episode. I mean, probably the one thing this episode shows is that Cochran doesn't care what you think of him as long as he's winning. And Shapiro basically tells Ido that they have submitted a motion to exclude all 62 allegations of domestic violence as a murder case, not a domestic violence case, nor is an inquiry into the characteristics and personality of Simpson, and all the evidence that was submitted is not relevant. And Hogman then says the council's reasoning is flawed and their logic is spacious. He says the defendant's character and prior history are the point. He then says to hypothetically pretend that they're not even going to tell the jury Nicole and Simpson were married. Their jurors would naturally ask, why would Simpson kill a perfect stranger? And it wouldn't make sense. It's only when they understand the context in their relationship and Simpson's jealousy that his motive for brutal murders could be understood. Which I definitely understand what Hogman is saying there. That you can't just, say, oh, this is definitely not, a domestic violence case, because it is. That's, their story. That's what led Simpson to killing Nicole. There had to be a reason, and that's why. So Darden then goes up, he says he wants to address a separate issue, and tells Ido that Fuhrman's going to play a very small role into this case, and they believe when they call him to the stand, they're going to be forced to go back 15 years to ask him completely irrelevant statements that people have claimed he's made. The statements are both racially insensitive and divisive, and the question is, why bring them up? They're going to ask him if he made a racial slur or repeat a racial epithet, but why ask if there's no legal purpose for it? But Cochran and the defense have a purpose for entering this area, and that purpose for entering that area, and that purpose is to inflame the passions of the jury and ask them to pick sides. And he says the N-word is a dirty, filthy word. It is so prejudicial and inflammatory that the use of it in any situation will evoke an emotional response from anyone that's black. And he says if he mentions that word to the jury, it will blind them to the truth, and they won't be able to discern what's true and what's not. It will impair their judgment, and it will affect their ability to be fair, and it will force the black jurors to make a choice. He says they strongly urge the court respectfully not to allow the word to be uttered at any point during the trial, and this really upsets Cochran, which again, remember, Cochran told his daughters never use that word, and that's why this scene is both very shocking and both very just really puts Cochran's, judgment in this case into perspective. And Cochran says he did not plan to speak on this matter, but he would be remiss if he did not respond. He says Darden's remarks this afternoon might be the most incredible remarks he heard in 32 years of court, and he says that his remarks are deeply demeaning to all African Americans, and he says he wants to apologize to all their people, and he says preposterous to say that African Americans are so unstable that they cannot hear offensive words without losing their moral sense of right and wrongs, which Cochran says they live with offensive words, looks, and treatment every day. day, and he says he's ashamed that Darden would allow himself to become an apologist for Fuhrman, and he says across America, African Americans are offended at that moment, and for a friend he deeply respects, this was outlandish, unfortunate, and unwarranted, and he then calls Darden the N-word disapprovingly, and Darden is not only humiliated, but he's also shocked because he did not think that Cochran would do this, and it's clear that Cochran, again, isn't really going with his own beliefs. He's just doing what he can to win. If that means opposing Darden, even though he agrees with him, even though because he's on the other side, he needs to say the opposite. If you remember, that's what Darden said to do. You need to just say the opposite of everything, and that's what they need to do there. So basically, Darden sees newspaper articles about him, and you can see that this is really broken Darden. They did a very good job. Whoever plays the actor, Darden, I don't know the actor that plays him, but he really did. Sterling K. Brown, that's who plays him. Sterling K. Brown did a great job in this episode with showing this side of Darden we haven't seen before. I mean, the Darden we see here is not the Darden that we've seen throughout this entire show. The Darden we've seen has been kind of together, holds himself really well. Not a lot affects him, but this really affects him. I mean, he really is broken from this, and basically he sees newspaper articles about him and Cochran, and has to look at it. Pretty much everyone is sided with Cochran, which it's understandable. I mean, Cochran's just a guy that's very passionate about what he says, and because of his passion, people really side with him. And Darden asks Gil if he can do a press conference so he can let everyone know what his role is in the case and who he really is. And Gil says he's just going to be drawing attention to himself and lets him know DAs don't go on talk shows, and he's not going to let him start that. And Darden then tells Marcia that they need to reconsider Fuhrman. He's wrong for this case, and she says that he had a rough couple of weeks and they're not changing their strategy because of it. She tells him to toughen up, and she says he's letting Cochran get into his head, and he talks about how in the 70s he had problems with affirmative action. Even though he busted his ass, he has good grades to get into his school, but every time he walked into class, he felt like people were staring at him, like he took some more worthy person's spot, and those feelings never leave. And almost 20 years later, he has to face it again because of Cochran, who's trashing him on any TV camera he can find. And you really have to think of Darden's position here. I mean, Darden is to be in the worst position possible. He is the only black attorney on this side of the case, and he used to be in, very good friends with Darden, with Cochran. They, got Cochran was his mentor, and Darden has faced problems before, but he clearly hasn't faced problems like this in a while. Probably because he's very well respected in his line of work, and he really hasn't thought about it, but this really is getting him to question more things. And Marcia says that he's wrong, just like all those idiots who doubt him back then. He's on the case because he's creative, dedicated, and smart. She says that's why she wanted him, and she says that he's going to help them win, and Cochran can go screw himself. Cochran's then going over his opening statements with Dale and what he's going to say to oppose what the DA is saying. He says that this case is destiny. They start to get intimate, which was really funny, actually. Just the way they were getting intimate was so nerdy. I loved it. But Cochran then gets a call from Carl and Sean, who says that they have a problem. Shapiro's staff messed up and didn't submit 12 of their witnesses into the discovery, and he's going to have to remove their names out of his opening statements tomorrow. And obviously, he's not going to do that because he just wrote this opening statement, and it all went with that, and he's not going to not do that. And Carl says they can't do that. Cochran says there comes a time when he has to let the sword fall for his client, and tomorrow is his day. And it really is just nonstop in this episode. If you guys can't tell, it really is. We then see another protest about Simpson. Shapiro gets out. Lee tells him to pretend they're at the Oscars, which I love that line because when you're at the Oscars, what do you got to do? You got to get through press and you got to get to your seat because you got to treat yourself like you're not a celebrity, like you're just another person. And that has to be interesting when you're at the Oscars because everyone's a celebrity there, and there are press, obviously, but everyone's a celebrity. So to them, you're kind of just another person there. You're not really this actor. You're nominated for Best Actor and things like that, but you're just another person. And that's very much like this courtroom. They're all famous attorneys and things like that, but they are just regular people. And they get away from the press, luckily. They do start the next hearing, and Ido brings in the jury, and Marcia presents her opening statement about how Simpson's not who they think he is. And I like how she did this. She talks about how he has this private side, that they've never met the face of a batterer or an abuser. And that's true. I mean, when you look at a celebrity, they're not who you think they are. I mean, they have a life. Every celebrity has their own personal life, and, it's their choice whether or not they show it. And basically, Cochran then goes up, gives his opening statement, and starts giving off the names, and Hogman then interrupts him, says that witnesses have not been turned over to the people, and Ito tells the bailiff to excuse the jury. Marcia tells him he needs to calm down. Hogman says the people have not received reciprocal discovery, and Carl says he will try to defend these issues. Ito says he's known Hogman as a colleague and as a trial lawyer, and he's never seen the expression on his face that he sees right now. He tells him to take a few deep breaths, and Hogman says he needs to slow himself down a bit, and Carl takes full responsibility for what happened. Hogman says the fact remains that the people have been denied to a fair trial, and Hogman starts to talk very slowly here. He starts to say a fair trial, kind of cuts himself off, and he says he has chest pain, collapses in the middle of the courtroom. Literally, I was shocked when this happened, and Marcia immediately gets him on a gurney and into the hospital, and Ito says they should adjourn for the day and court will resume at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And that's crazy. I mean, just the fact that he just collapsed in the middle of the courtroom. Now, a lot of people are going to wonder, did William Hogman, the real Bill Hogman, did he actually collapse in the courtroom? No. In fact, Bill Hogman, I don't even think was part of the case. I looked up. I don't really think that he was part of the OJ case, but in this he did, and it works because Hogman now isn't coming back. Now they have a reason for Hogman not to come back, and they talk about how the building's cursed, and Marsh says that his wife said he will be fine, tells Gil to trust her, the team will pick up the slack, they got a good group, and he says that Hogman had a lot of responsibility, and she's only one person, and she thinks that they should promote Darden, that this is the right thing to do, and this really does seem like it's a good move for him. I mean, he's in a very awkward position right now. He's going through a lot, and this would kind of motivate him, make him stronger. And she says that he took Cochran's best shot, came up strong in opening statements, and that's hard to do. She says he would make an excellent co-prosecutor, and Gil thinks about it, and Marsh continues to persuade him. Marsh then calls Darden, tells him about, what happened with Hogman, and basically talks to him about elevating him to co-prosecutor, and when he hears about it, he's immediately interested, and obviously he takes it, which I was very happy about. So we get this really interesting scene after this with Dunn, basically, Dominic. We get this really interesting scene with him. He's at this dinner. He's pretty much telling everyone what happened, what he heard in the courtroom, what's going to happen next week. It was a cool way of getting away exposition. This wasn't really exposition. This was more of him just telling the events, and it would make sense. I mean, if you're on this jury, it would be probably just a huge highlight of your life. I mean, being on this jury, getting to play out the O.J. Simpson trial. I guess, again, I don't know if Dominic Dunn was actually on this jury or not, if he is very interesting. But what I really liked about the scene is the way that it was done. I mean, they're all clearly against Simpson, but all of their maids are black, and when they come in, they suddenly just stop because they're afraid of maybe shaming them or making it seem like they're racist. I mean, with so much going on in this case and so much publicity and things like that, they really got to be careful what they say. And even though they don't want to be careful, the fact they have to censor themselves in their own home is crazy to think about, and the way that scene was done was very interesting. So I really like the way that was handled. But we do find out here that they're going to go to Simpson's mansion, and basically then we get another really crazy thing, another really crazy scandal that I don't know if it happened, but if it did, holy shit, because this is crazy. Cochran goes to Simpson's mansion and says that it won't do at all. Together, him, Sean, and Carl replace a ton of the pictures, move items around to make a better impression for Simpson, and they basically blackify his entire apartment. I mean, they replace all the photos of Nicole. They get rid of all the pictures of his daughters and sons and daughters. I mean, they really make it so it's not at all who he is. And Cochran goes to visit Simpson in prison, and he talks about how when the jurors tour the crime scene in Rockingham, it's going to be important for them all to make a positive impression. It will be the only time they see him outside the courtroom. All eyes will be on him, but he's used to it. But he doesn't want to be surprised when he sees that they've redecorated. And Simpson asks why he do such a thing, and Cochran says that they want to make a good impression and for the jurors to relate to and admire more. And Simpson says they already admire him. Everybody loves his house. It was in Sunset Magazine. I like that Simpson isn't necessarily okay with this, but he basically has to go along with it. And the way the scene was done, I really like this. Cochran's trying to tell him why they had to do this, and his reasons I understand, but again, it's very deceitful and very sleazy what he's doing. I mean, he's basically, basically hiding what his apartment really is just so he can make a good impression and get the jury on their side. I mean, it really isn't the truest thing to do. Definitely it's very dishonest what he's doing, and basically he talks about if he had any friends that were black and things like that, because he doesn't have a lot of people in the black community, as we know. And Simpson says that AC, of course, was his friend, and he asks if he's trying to say something about him. And Cochran says he's not judging him, but being nicknamed the mayor of Brentwood doesn't forge any bonds with the jury. People he needs to acquit of him of the double murder. He says he can go along with all that. And he says when they say mayor of Brentwood, he knows what they mean when they're saying that. He says he never left anybody behind. He did what he had to do. He manifested himself out of a messed up situation, and don't think that there weren't people back from where he came from hanging on to the back of his shirts the whole time with a handout trying to get him to drag them out too. He says it doesn't work like that. You got to get it on your own because nobody can get it for you, and he's never apologized for buying a beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood with people who did berate him for getting it, obviously, because, it was a really nice house, and he says he's never apologizing for that, and Cochran says he hopes he understands what they got to do, and he says he does. So Darden and Marcia then go into the mansion where the jury is. Darden asks if everything's all right. Marcia asks what happened, why they cleared out the places, doesn't tell them anything. She was a mother, there was a family. Cochran and Carl soon arrive. The jury goes gaga over everything and pretty much has fallen for Cochran's tricks. I mean, again, this isn't really what Simpsons Mansion was like. They basically just, changed it so so it's more jury friendly. And basically, Marcia asks if he can believe, and Darden says he can't. This is a complete misrepresentation, and this isn't Simpson at all. And Simpson even tells Robert that these aren't even his kids. He doesn't even know who these people are. And I like the way this scene was done. Again, it shows this was not Simpson's idea. This was all Cochran's, and he never really was okay with it. He basically was just forced to agree with it because he obviously wants to get out of there. So he was just like, okay, fine. And Marcia then asks Ida why all of Nicole's personal effects have been removed from Bundy before the jury's been able to see it, and all the African art and pictures of Simpson and his golfing buddies. She says the entire house has been staged, and she asks where the naked pictures of Paula is, and she says it's been replaced with a picture of his mother in a wheelchair. Darden then sits down, and Simpson tells him to get off his bench, yells at him, and Darden tells Cochran he needs to keep his defendant under control. Cochran says he just got emotional, and Cochran says there's something he's been meaning to tell him. Whatever happens, don't do Fuhrman. Make the white people do him. And you can tell that he kind of is, kind of forcing him to listen to him. And Darden is on the phone with his father, basically rants about what Cochran's doing. His father tries to calm him down. Darden thinks that Cochran is intimidated by him, and his father says he's been going on for 20 minutes about how he's in charge now. Well, then fine, he's in charge, so act like it and stand up for himself. And I like seeing his father in this episode. As we know, his father wasn't really part of the trial, but now that, Darden's involved, he is involved with the trial. We even see him watching the trial at one point, which I really did like seeing. And basically, he talks about how Cochran is trying to mess with his head. Could it be possible he's just trying to give him some good advice, black man to black man, and that Darden is just thinking that because of the whole fallout and everything that's going on there. So I really think that's interesting what his father brought up, that, Cochran might not necessarily be manipulating you. It might just come across that way because you're threatened by him and you don't want to admit that. So Darden then asks Fuhrman how he feels about interracial couples. Fuhrman says he doesn't care. Darden says he didn't ask him if he cared. What's there to care about? And Fuhrman says he doesn't have an opinion there, the same as everybody else. And Darden asks if he has any hobbies. Fuhrman says he collects World War II memorabilia, medals mostly. And Darden asks about his sports heroes. And Fuhrman says George Foreman and Magic Johnson, which of course he's surprised to hear about. And he asks in the past he's expressed a dislike for African Americans, and he says he did not. Darden asks if he ever unfairly targeted African Americans, and he says he didn't. And he asks if he's been accused, and Fuhrman says that they will say anything to get off, and Darden asks if he's ever used the M-word, and Fuhrman asks what this has to do with the case. And I like how seriously Darden took this question, because you can tell, again, it really means a lot to him. He asks if the defense called a witness that testifies that he's used it. How does he respond to that? And Fuhrman says that he hasn't ever, and Darden then tells Marcia he's not putting Fuhrman on the stand, and it's not because of Cochran, and it's not because he worked SID. Marcia asks if they're past this, and Darden says that they're not. He says he'll take any of Hogman's witnesses, and she says that he had the coroner. She says that she can't present who had the glove, and Fuhrman will present best if he has him, and Darden asks why that is. He tells her to say it's because he's black, and she says that his dislike for him will read for the jury anyway, and she doesn't admit that it's because he's black, and I like that he tried to get her to admit this, because that's kind of the reason why he's on this case. And you can tell why Darden kind of feels out of place here because he's the only person, of course, on, in his work that is color. And she says that his dislike for him will read for the jury anyway. And she says she will take him. And she asks, what's so difficult? It's just a cop on a stand. And that there's really nothing wrong with it. He shouldn't worry about it. But then we get to the ending. And the ending of this episode, very interesting. We see Fuhrman's in his house. We see he has Nazi World War II medals, meaning most of what he said that Darden was pretty much bullshit, and he was just trying to cover himself up, and that's how the episode ends. So, what a whirlwind of an episode. Seriously, guys, this episode was crazy. Every scene was just insane. It really seemed like this was an episode that wasn't stopping, and I love that the momentum of this episode, it just went really quickly, and this was a long episode, but it went really quickly, and I was very happy about that. I really loved the way this episode played out. But I really like the way Cochran and Darden are playing out. I mean, you can tell that Cochran, even if he agrees what Darden is saying, he needs to go against him because that's how he's going to win. He's not concerned about the truth. He's concerned about winning. And it really does go against a lot of his beliefs because, as we know, he told his daughter straight out, do not say the N-word, and he said it to Darden's face. So clearly, he doesn't really care about his morals here. He cares about winning, and that's his main priority, which is very interesting to look at. And and Darden definitely does have a moral code. Like, he sticks to his morals, and that's why Darden and Cochran are so different, because Cochran basically cuts out his heart. He's one of those men that he cuts out his heart when he's at the trial, and maybe he still has those morals, but when it comes to the opposing side, he cuts out his heart and basically says what he's been told to say against them, so that way he will win, because that's obviously what he wants to do, and that's why Cochran is such a brilliant man, and that's why, he has just a better chance of winning, I think, which really sucks because of the fact that Darden really is saying everything that Cochran believes, but he can't say that he agrees because, of course, Darden's on the opposing side. So it's a very complicated situation, and I like the way that's playing out. And I also like the way this is really affecting Darden. I mean, you can tell that this is really affecting the way he thinks, his attitude, I mean, the way, his internal, external, just everything about him, it's really affecting. And the way they did that here was so well done, and I definitely really love that. Like I said, Sterling K. Brown really handled all that perfectly, and I really like the way that was done. Very good stuff there. Does Marcia really have Darden in this case because he's black? I mean, that's a big part of it, but I don't think that's the only reason. I think that she does trust him, obviously, but the main reason, yeah, is because he's black, and she doesn't really want to admit that, which is very interesting. Let's talk about Simpson, because we know his entire apartment was his entire mansion was redecorated, and very interesting situation the way that that was done. I mean, that really was crazy. Like I said, I don't know if that actually happened, but if it did, I mean, that really is insane. And again, that's something that is completely against Cochran's moral code, but the only reason he did that is that way they can get the jury on their side, and they can have a better chance of winning, because again, what is he there to do? He's there to win. He's not there to tell the truth. He's there to win, which is very interesting. And again, it's not right, but that's how they're going to win, and I think that's very interesting the way that that's being done. Fuhrman clearly is lying through his teeth. I mean, Fuhrman, I think, is, again, like Cochran, just doing what he can to protect his own ass, and if he really does collect this, Nazi World War II medals, I mean, we know that the Nazis were against black people, so it would make sense why Fuhrman probably did say the things he said, and the things that they were talking about, I'm pretty sure Fuhrman did say. Now, I don't think that Mark Fuhrman actually did collect Nazi World War II medals in, like, real life. I think that's just something they add in here to make things more interesting, but overall, guys, amazing episode. This episode was just stunning. Amazing scene after amazing scene. I couldn't get over this episode. This is probably my favorite thing I'm watching on TV right now, I gotta say. Every week it gets more and more interesting. I really am getting into this story. I love the way that's playing out. Let me know what you guys thought of this highly intense episode. I absolutely loved every minute of this episode. By far best episode of the season. And I honestly have no idea how they're going to top it. I mean, I know next week is all about how people view Marcia, things like that. We kind of got that last week, but next week's an entire episode emphasizing that, so that's very interesting overall. We'll have to see what's going on there. But overall, guys, let me know what you guys saw this episode. Absolutely loved this episode, and I will see you guys in my next video, which will be for tonight's episode Legend tomorrow, and I will see you guys for that. Okay, bye.